In terms of sort of slightly more, does anyone want to ask anything about what I've said so far? Does that make sense? Just shout if you want to ask anything, because some of this is quite mind-bending. Okay, so last year, in my university in Middlesex, we put out a report called Music on the Blockchain. You can get it free online if you want. It's open access, etc. And Nick Mason of Pink Floyd wrote the foreword. And we put it out in conjunction with the Featured Artists Coalition in the UK. And what we said in the report is that there's 4 areas in which the technology could be transformative. One of them is the idea you could have and I'll go through this in a second. The first one was the idea you could have a networked database of music copyright. By networked, I mean not in silos, not lots of different databases that are interoperable. You could have faster royalty payments, dramatically faster than they are currently, and you could make them more efficient. You could have increased transparency in terms of where payments are going. And you could use this technology to access other sources of funding. And just go through those briefly and explain how they might play out. So the network database idea, as you probably know at the moment, there is not one single complete database of all song and recording copyright. We've got silos. Blockchains are more like this. So this is a little graphic of, it's tiny and blurry actually, I'm sorry about that, but basically that is a distributed structure as opposed to a centralized structure. And this is integral to how blockchains work. That was the whole idea of Bitcoin, as I say, this peer-to-peer network that doesn't need a central bank. So what you could have is you could have a way of storing information that is accessible to all and gives you a single source of truth. This is the key thing. Use your peer-to-peer network to achieve consensus, agreement on the state of some information, and once you agree, that's logged on the blockchain. And what's logged on the blockchain is there forever. If I log a tune that I haven't written, it can be logged that I made a mistake, and you can log that correction on the blockchain as well. But the record itself stays there. And the idea is, obviously, we've had attempts to build international databases before, the GRD, etc. Why could blockchain possibly work if those things haven't? The answer in another report you might be interested in is by Jeremy Silver. It also came out last year, and it's called Blockchain or the Chain Gang. And I think it's also available for free online. And he talks about it in there, but what the reason why it could conceivably work where other initiatives, for instance, the GRD, failed, is that blockchains encourage peer-to-peer work. And you could have a database that's built in a bottom-up fashion instead of a centralized top-down fashion. You might need a layer of governance. So with Bitcoin, anyone who wants to can get involved, or at least theoretically they can. Actually now, as it's got so big, there are actually mining pools, mainly in China, that control an increasing amount of power, but that's a different thing. Theoretically, with something like Bitcoin, anyone who wants to can get involved. If we're talking about putting copyright information on, we might want a layer of governance. And some people have suggested that this whole process will remove collection societies, for instance, but you could also argue that this layer of governance is precisely where collection societies come in. But you somehow, a little bit like how you have with the International Movie Database for film information, you can have users uploading information, possibly that gets approved, and then you have your slowly building network database. And the key thing is that the users are incentivized because they are the stakeholders. This is the difference. We also, the second thing on the report was around speeding up royalty payments. So in a Bitcoin blockchain, the blocks are formed every 10 minutes. And different people are looking at changing that. So in banking, they're looking at a system that's called Ripple, that's trying to speed that up dramatically because you can't compete with Visa, etc. if you only have a block every 10 minutes. Obviously, Bitcoin was never originally conceived to compete with the likes of Visa, but that's how it's been used. But so you could, even with the Bitcoin blockchain, which is relatively inefficient for this kind of thing, you could be talking about royalty payments arriving it to artists within minutes, say, rather than months or even years, as we know is the case at the moment. And this is because you would use something called smart contracts, which I mentioned, these programmable transactions, which I mentioned. And you could set them up to allocate funds in a much more efficient way than they do at the moment, so that instead of passing from party A, it takes maybe a cut and on to party B, etc. You agree your splits, your percentage splits in advance, and then the money gets fired out in those allocated percentages using smart contracts. And if you want a practical example of how this would work, Imogen Heap did something very early. I think this was late 2015. It was a track called Tiny Human. It's on the Ethereum blockchain. It was with Ujo Music, although actually the guy who was then the key person at Ujo Music is now running a different company called Blocker. Ujo still exists. But you can see this online. And it was very proof of concept, very early thing, because it was 2015 and you couldn't contribute unless you had Ether, which is even more obscure than Bitcoin. It's the digital currency you need to work on the Ethereum blockchain. And there was the subsection of Ether owners who are Imogen Heap fans would have been pretty small in 2015. So the amount of money she raised for this song is only about $100, I think. It's a very small amount. But as a way of working, it's amazing. Look at Tiny Human online, and you'll see Imogen lists all the people who were involved in the track. So session musicians, I think like the engineer or the producer is on there as well. And you can see who earned what from the track. As I say, the amounts are tiny, but it's all there transparently and fired out simultaneously through smart contracts as users consume the piece of music. So the speed of payment and the efficiency of payment increase dramatically. Then there's the issue of transparency. So, well, we mentioned NDAs on the previous panel, but also there are these black boxes into which royalty disappears and no one quite knows where it's gone. It's difficult for artists and their managers to audit what they are owed. Blockchain sometimes has a reputation for being very private, because the thing about Bitcoin is that it's anonymous or it's pseudonymous. You cannot trace someone's public key, which is this long hash of, well, it's a long string of numbers and letters that's nonsense, gobbledygook. You can't trace that in any normal way back to a human. So you can tell this long string of numbers and letters did X and transferred that money and so on, but you don't know who that is. It's just an avatar. So people think of this as being very secretive. It's cryptography, clever maths that keeps everything secret. But the actual transactions are not secret. The actual transactions are extremely public. That's what the blockchain is. The blockchain is a ledger of how money transfers. It's a ledger of every single transaction. So transparency is fundamental to how blockchains work. Some artists and some music industry bodies might not want all information to be transparent. They might have very good reasons for not making all information transparent. And I've heard some people terrified by this idea of transparency because information could be commercially sensitive. But it's not necessarily the case that all information has to be transparent. You can have layers of access, and you, depending on the use case, you can grant access to the parties who need access. So don't be terrified by the idea that everyone needs to see everything to be able to use the blockchain. Otherwise, banks would not be in this space. And the last thing in the report is around alternate sources of funding, in particular crowdfunding. And actually, I thought this was slightly abstract when we put it in last year, but now it seems very, very obvious because there's been an explosion in what they call ICOs, which is a kind of play on IPOs. It stands for initial coin offerings, and it's a similar thing to this. So what we said in the report is that at the moment, as a crowdfunder, if you invest in a crowdfunding campaign, for one thing, you can't be certain how the money will be used. You can't be certain it will be used as the artist says it will be used, and also you can't be certain that you'll get your money back if the campaign doesn't raise the amount of money it's supposed to raise. So there's a couple of problems there. But also there's a problem in that you don't get a share of the value of the project in which you invest. So you get your CD or whatever if you invest 10 euros, but if that track then gets picked up for a massive sync, you don't get a little cut of the sync, because it would be very complicated to manage. But what we've said in the report is that, in fact, you could manage it using blockchains. You could have a smart contract that's set up and says, okay, you invested X amount, you'll be, if X happens, if a track brings in this amount of money, reaches the threshold, you will get a share of the royalties. And it becomes possible to facilitate that on blockchains. I won't talk about these in detail, but we also mentioned the idea of tip jars. So just like you tip loose, you throw loose change into a guitar case of a busker, pennies, you can't do that online because the transaction fees are too high. Now actually with Bitcoin, as it's got so popular, the transaction fees have gone up for complicated reasons that we don't go into. So you would not now transfer a penny to someone in Bitcoin because you'd pay probably £4 to transfer it, and it would only cost you a penny, or the euro equivalent. So the micropayments are not quite as exciting as they were for Bitcoin, but there are hundreds of digital currencies now. So some people in this space think the conversation is still only about Bitcoin, but other people see Bitcoin as a very clunky, early, first-generation example of something that has at least one and maybe more subsequent generations already in the last decade. And the level of efficiency is pretty varied. So you could have an artist setting up a paywall and being able to access paywall-protected content by means of some kind of micropayment. Does anyone want to ask anything about any of them?
Ci sono domande per Marcos? Lui è molto contento di rispondere e io di tradurle per voi. I have a question, Marcus. With your team, what are your plans for the immediate future?
Well, so we put out that report last year. I'm going to be spending some time in London with an organisation called Digital Catapult, which is promoting digital growth, I suppose, especially among SMEs in the UK. As a researcher in residence from October, looking at creative industries applications in more detail, and particularly looking at real use cases rather than a lot of the work that's been done so far, which is a bit abstract and sort of theoretical. It won't just be music, but music will be a key part of it. There are also really interesting people looking at, for instance, using this technology in fashion to see transparency in supply chains, in gaming as well. So looking at some of those instances as well.
Yeah, I heard it's being used in agriculture to just keep track of the kind of supplements or other things that they use for certain, so down to the very plant. So you know exactly what's happened there. So that's very interesting. So we'll let you finish if no one has any questions for you.
Yeah,
okay? Yeah.
No, I don't know people in Italian universities, and I'd like to. So let me know if you can help.
Yeah, I tried to make contact with a blockchain lab, Milan.
Okay.
But I only found out about them very, very recently, so it wasn't possible for them to be here this morning. But I know there's interest, and there's quite a lot going on in our city as well. Yeah. So
I have. It's not exactly a question; it's more of a suggestion. That when you were speaking earlier, you said that you talked about Bitcoin being on the dark web, and then moving into more respectable areas like banking. And what else was there? That deciding who owns land in Africa. I think it's an exciting mechanism, but I think the point where where you perhaps feel it's going to save us from sin is where I become skeptical. When you look at rights in the music business and you look at recordings from 40 or 70 years ago, you're going to find maybe there is no answer to who owns what rights. And I think that's the problem you're going to run into in all sorts of areas.
Let me address that because it's really important. The good thing about being an academic, so I spent my 20s in music, right? And then for the last 5 years or so, I've been in a university. And the good thing about being in a university is that you can come at these things without a particular axe to grind. I've seen a lot of panels with people who are running startups, who are obviously evangelical about the startups that they're running. But what we can do is we can be a critical voice, right? That's not necessarily a negative voice, but we're slightly outside as academics, looking in. And I definitely wouldn't say that the blockchain is going to save us from sin. I would actually, which I think was actually your phrase. In fact, I would say that if we don't get it right, and we're talking in the context of European independent music, right? If we don't get it right, it will do the opposite of that. So there is an organization called the Open Music Initiative, which I'm part of in a fairly loose way, and so are other universities, including big universities in the States like MIT and Harvard and Berkeley who host it. But also part of this are digital service providers. Also part of this are the three majors. Now, from your perspective, independent labels perspective, I would think that you want to be careful about this, right? Because you want to be part of the conversation as to how standards are set for the future. So that's one thing, is that I'm not saying that this is, a silver bullet. I think it's good to be aware of it because you probably want to be part of the conversation. Nobody wants to do a Napster and just pretend that this is not going to happen. I think probably it is going to happen, and I think that the widespread adoption in all these different sectors is making me think that. In a way, it's what's happening much beyond music that's making me think, okay, this is quite significant. I'm not saying it's more significant than virtual reality or artificial intelligence, all these other things, but I think it's equivalent, maybe. The other thing is that it could be very dangerous because you have distributed databases, IPFS, Interplanetary File System, is coming through, which is a distributed peer-to-peer database. And if takedown notices are not very effective at the moment, they'll be even less effective against that because it's distributed. You wouldn't even know who you're trying to take down. So actually, there's a definite note of caution. That's quite apart from technical risks. So because I work in a university, I'm in music and I work with media people, but I also work with computer science colleagues in my cluster. And they would be talking about technical risks to say, well, there's a problem with scaling this technology. And also there was a big high-profile thing that happened last year called the DAO, with the DAO. And basically, it was a massive crowd-funded venture on Ethereum, very high-profile. They raised something like $150 million in crowdfunding. It was a major crowd campaign. But then it wasn't exactly hacked, but let's say there was a hole in the code, and something like a third of the money came out again. So there's a huge tech risk. This is very new. Even key people at Ethereum are tweeting out, don't use this for mission-critical stuff. This is in the experimental phase. So you're absolutely right that we should end on a note of caution. I think we should be aware of this as we go ahead, but we shouldn't assume that it's going to solve all our problems. You know, humans need to work out how to use the technology. But I suppose the last thing I would say is just to make it something that's not abstract. So all of this seems pretty pie in the sky, and it's like distributed ledgers, and I've saved you all the talk about Merkle trees and hashes and like OP return functions and all of this mind-blending stuff. The key thing is have a play with it, right? So Bitcoin seems really abstract and strange. You can get Bitcoin. Don't buy loads. Don't buy it thinking that you're going to get rich. And like I say, one Bitcoin will cost you 2,000 euros, so you're probably not going to buy hundreds of Bitcoins. But you can get a little bit of Bitcoin. And also, you can go onto a website I really recommend called Ascribe. Ascribe were mainly set up for digital artwork. It's visual art, right? But they're phenomenal what they're doing. They've just brought out a really exciting protocol for intellectual property across the board, which is called Koala IP. The company has pivoted into another really interesting direction, which is called Big Chain DB. But Ascribe, their original incarnation, was about registering visual artworks on a blockchain. But you can pull in other things as well. And it's the easiest thing in the world to use. You drag and drop, you get a hash, and you will start to see what this is all about. It's only step one. Even that was a couple of years old. Things have moved on since that. Even that company's moved on since that. But it will start to seem a bit more real. And we can maybe weigh up the benefits and the risks as we move forward.
Helen?
I just wanted to say I think it's great that PMI has organised this panel as part of a session this morning, because part of our responsibilities as the independent sector is to lead, to think about what we can do, how we can work better, faster, smarter, and that I think is another element that sets us aside as Michelle was saying earlier. I mean, with 80% of all new releases and 80% of all new artists signed into the independent sector, we were in a fantastic position to make changes, to be ahead of the game. And I think it's just wanted to say thanks very much for organising this session. I think it's great. Thank you.
I think we all need to be part of the conversation, as you said, Marcus. And yes, we have a responsibility to be aware of what's going on. And there's one consideration, if I may, just the last one.
Sure.
I am sort of, from the point of view of independent labels, perhaps one of the key things to this is the danger of disintermediation. So are we going to lose our role? Are we going to disappear? Because if no one needs to be in between who uses the service and the artist or the right holders, what's our function?
Yeah, well, so absolutely fundamental to blockchain technology is this idea of disintermediation, this idea of cutting out the middleman. As I say, going back to Bitcoin, the whole idea was getting rid of banks, this peer-to-peer alternative. And you're completely right, Francesca, the question of who's being disintermediated is key. If you look at some of the sometimes quite hysterical writing about this online, you'll see people talking about labels are no longer needed, collection societies are no longer needed, etc. Now, obviously, I think that if intermediaries add value, and I imagine most people in this room think that they do, they're not going to be cut out. But I think we should be aware of that potential. For instance, collection societies could have, as I say, this role in governance so that they approve data, they give it something that's a little bit like a blue tick on Twitter that says, yes, this is verified. Digital service providers are very into the idea that they could have a direct relationship with artists, say, But they don't want to cut majors out, I would imagine, because they need the back catalogue.
I suppose so.
So the indie labels, which have got the new releases and the bulk of that, I think there's a conversation to be had about how they fit in and how they make sure they're not the middlemen being cut out.
Yes, I suppose so. We're safe for the minute. Thank you very much for this.